This is Varroa Mites and Honeybee Colonies. Thank you for watching. I am Kevin England. In this lesson, we reach a milestone of sorts, and that is it's the first lesson that is really not about honeybees directly. Instead, we turn to the impacts of Varroa mites. Now, there's a backstory about Varroa mites that we will cover in a later lesson. The origins, the impacts of mites in beekeeping, how they've spread to the U.S., and so on. For now, however, we are going to be laser focused on what matters for you, and that is the understanding of the life-threatening risks to your colony that Varroa mites present. In this lesson, we do a quick primer on Varroa mite impacts to colonies. We will explore the mite population dynamic and explain how those dynamics impact honeybee colonies. We will discuss the correlation of honeybee population in conjunction with Varroa mite populations, and we'll end with how to prevent the perfect storm that is coming later this year. The storm that, if left unresolved, can result in the demise of your colonies. The first thing to understand is the physical damage that Varroa mites can wreak on honeybees. It happens in two ways. The first one is that they actually wound the bee. When their mouth parts bite into the bee or the larva, they can inflict damage, physical damage, to the substrate of the bee's exoskeleton. The second part is from those mouth parts come contaminants. Vectored viruses go into the bees, and that wreaks havoc, obviously, from the virus load that gets transformed. Now, Varroa mites are found in the hive, on the bees, sometimes referred to as the phoretic stage, where they're hopping on to be transported around, and of course they will also enter into the developing cells of honeybees just prior to being capped. To expand upon that a little further, there are two places that the Varroa mite are going to attack the bees. The first one is the adult bees. They'll be on the underside, underneath the abdomen in between the plates, attacking the fat body tissues of the adult bees. They're extracting a protein there in order to complete their egg-laying cycle, something that they do not make internally. And they're getting other resources, of course, from attacking the bees. The other part is in the fifth stage of development of larva. There is a pheromone given off from the larva to the worker bees that is said to cause the worker bees to cap the cell. At that time, the Varroa mite exit the adults, go down into the brood food, hide underneath the larva, and then they set up shop to reproduce in the cell while also biting into and feeding on the larva in the process. When considering the fact that Varroa mites go into the larval cells, it's interesting to think about this from the broad spectrum. They can go into a queen cell, they can go into a worker cell, and they obviously do go into drone cells. It's human nature to try and say that the mites have some sort of preference. Preference is probably not the right word for it, but in the beneficial aspect, it's more preferential for a Varroa mite to go into a drone cell because the gestation of the drone is longer, and that means that the Varroa mite benefits by having a longer cycle to generate offspring. That plays a role in the ratio of mites that can be produced during the time that they're in with the larva. What you're viewing here is a capture of Varroa mites dead on a bottom board after a treatment. We start with this simple concept that if you treat your hives, you are going to see dead Varroa mites. Even if you started with a package and or a nuke early in the season, they are in there and they are ever present. In this magnified view of the same image, you get a sense of what the Varroa mites look like. The mature adults are brick red. They are smooth with a sheen that has a semi-gloss style appearance. From the top, you can see their mouth parts are towards the front. They don't really have any legs, so to speak, sticking out from underneath the shell. And the legs and mouth parts become even more apparent when you look at them from the underside. You'd be surprised when you see them walking around that they move rather quickly and they somewhat look like a crab as they wander around inside on the honeybees and or on the larvae. Well, I say you can see mites walking around on honeybees. This is not a customary sight. You don't typically see them on the backs of the bees because their objective is to go underneath and feed. Every once in a while, though, when you see one getting on board or hitching a ride, you will see them on the backs of the bees. If you see a lot of Varroa mites on the backs of the bees as you're doing visual inspections, it means you have a massive amount of Varroa mites in your colony. It might seem rather disturbing as a human being to think about this, but varroa mites go into the larva cells. The female will lay eggs and then mate with those eggs, her offspring, in order to generate future generations of varroa mites. We said that they prefer drone cells, but they do mate in worker cells also. And the key takeaway here on this slide is that they produce multiple offspring in the cell for every honeybee that emerges. The ratio is skewed to the mite's favor. Picking up on the last slide, the ratio is 1.3 to 2.6 by research, which is hard to grasp, so to speak. So let's simplify that, split the difference. To emphasize the point, somewhere in the middle of that range is the number 2. Every time a bee emerges from the cell, at least 2 mites are coming out if mites were being produced in the cells. It stands to reason that if the varroa mite prefer drone larvae, then when they emerge from the cells, the drone larvae are going to carry the varroa mites. In the early spring, when there's a lot of drones, you will find varroa mites on the drone population. That's an important factor to consider when thinking about colony dynamics through the seasons. The corresponding presentation to this one is varroa mite monitoring, and this is an important aspect to consider. In those early days when the varroa mites are on the drones and you're doing mite monitoring in the brood area, sampling worker bees, you might be misled in the population of varroa mites. You're not sampling varroa mites in the cells and you're not sampling drones. At some point when the drone population decreases in the colony because the queen's going to stop making drones when mating season is over, the population of varroa mites riding around on the drones will transform to the workers and it will show up in your mite monitoring. This is a really important concept to consider. The timing of the way that this progresses, colonies will implode. We're setting the stage up for a very bad situation where the transformation of impact of varroa mites is transforming to the worker colony, and that is a recipe for hives to implode. The workers are the heartbeat of the colony. They are responsible for assuring the longevity of the colony through collection of resources and performing all of the vital work that takes place, including feeding their nestmates and the future population of bees in development. If they are impacted by viruses from the varroa mites, they are passing on those viruses to their nestmates. As an aside, if you have ever had the chance to view an observation hive, you will see at times that workers remove damaged larvae. And when they do this, again, squeamish to consider for humans, they shred the carcass of the bee they are removing and pull it out bit by bit for disposal. Sometimes they pull it out whole, other times they chop it up and move it around in some sort of concession line there. They will also at times cannibalize the larva when food sources are low. Consider that the damaged larva could have succumbed to viruses, and that too becomes a plausible pathway for virus transmission. Research demonstrates that there are a number of viruses that can be transmitted. The ones on your screen are the more common ones, and You may potentially be able to see some of these when you have a Varroa mite infestation. Deformed wing virus is something that you see occasionally where bees come out of the cell and they have shriveled up wings, and that bee will never fly or be a productive member of the colony. Acute bee paralysis, chronic bee paralysis, you'll see bees trembling like they're having a seizure. Sometimes you find them walking out in front of the hive. The bad news is if you do start to see these signs on the bees, you're probably past the point of having what we would consider a major infestation. Think of this now in the context of where you are in your beekeeping season. For every bee that emerges where Varroa mites are present, 2 mites are created. Now think about that in the growth of your colony since it started. The population is exploding, and with it, under the fold, so are the Varroa mites. Now, we spent the time learning the impacts of what mites do to bees, and it should be evident by now that if you do not control the Varroa mites, it can lead to catastrophic outcomes. I've come to coin a phrase for a dynamic that I call supreme colonies. Season after season, for over a decade, I've heard beekeepers say that their best, biggest, most productive colony is always the one that dies on the overwinter. The reason being, now that you understand some of the population dynamics, is they're overwhelmed by mites. These supreme colonies are mite factories. And I want to plant the seed to you now that I would advocate you would take supreme colonies and break them into smaller populations over your beekeeping career. This chart comes from the Honeybee Health Coalition. It's a resource for Varroa management that I am going to recommend by the end of this presentation. They make an interesting point to say that beekeeping runs in seasons. Thinking about it from a mature hive, wintertime is the dormant season. You come into spring and you have population increase. That achieves population peak, and then it tapers off population decrease only to finish with dormant. These are interesting ways to think about the way that the population works for honeybees on the orange line in correlation to Varroa mites, and we're going to explore that a little bit further. In research, there's a term for keeping the mite impact low to the bees. It's called economic threshold. If you can keep the Varroa mites in check, then the bees will be productive. Once they reach a certain threshold and go over that, it becomes economically detrimental to the colony's survival. So one of the concepts is, out of the dormant stage, and incidentally, when you start with a package or a treated nuke, you're somewhat in the dormant stage because you have a low population. You start with low Varroa mites. That's why in the beginning we didn't focus too much, but now we're getting to population growth and peak population. We have to consider the mites. So the first thing to say is, in the beginning of the season next year, and for you this year, let's keep the Varroa mites low, but recognize there's going to be a point when the mite population comes up and we're going to need to do something about it. As a rule of thumb, it is emerging now that when the Varroa mites are at their peak population, so is the drone population. As the drones taper off in early spring and head into summer, that's the time frame that Varroa mites are going to transfer to the worker bees, and that provides the right opportunity to be treating your hives and killing all of the Varroa mites that are riding around on your drones. This is an important time for you to consider that your population is growing. We're going from 1 box to 2, and we're building a full-size colony. As you do your visual inspections, everything looks perfectly fine, but there's one thing, a dynamic to consider that's kind of keeping this visual of mite impacts away from you, and it has to do with creating new bees. As the queen is laying up to 1,000 eggs a day and rotating out the stock of bees as they wear out, doing all the work that they do, you tend not to see the impact to the bees, but the storm is coming. At the time when drones taper off and the mites transfer to the workers, and the queen starts to slow down, that is when full-size, perfectly looking colonies are starting to see the impacts of Varroa mites. You won't visually see it right away, but it's going to lead to a massively sick colony as the colony progresses through summer, and it's important to recognize at that juncture to treat your colonies and ensure that they never cross that threshold of the entire population becoming sick due to Varroa mite impacts that are on the rise because of the explosion of Varroa mite populations. As we come to a close in this presentation, it's really important to know that you're in charge of thwarting the perfect storm. You now understand the mite population dynamic and its potential impact to your colonies. This is not a time to procrastinate. Time and time again, beekeepers who wait until late July, early August, sometimes even to September, find that their bees implode and they have catastrophic results in the overwinter. It's because they let the viruses and the injuries to the bees take hold because of the mite population. It's your job to change the balance from when Varroa mites become so populous that they have economic threshold impact to your colony. Monitor early, treat when warranted, keep the Varroa mite loads low. That's really the success to beekeeping these days, and it's probably one of the most important takeaways of how to be a successful beekeeper in the age of Varroa mites. It should be quite evident at this point how Varroa mites impact the colonies, and we have a couple key homework assignments to do to follow up on this. One of the number one things is to learn how to monitor how many mites are in the colony and then understand how to effectively treat the colony to eliminate Varroa mites if the thresholds are high. We'll also talk about another pest of the honeybees coming up, which is the small hive beetle, something that's not a major concern in the mid-Atlantic region, but for some of us, just different pockets of the area, it is a true nuisance, and we'll get you indoctrinated to that. A lot of things to learn as we hit the summer stretch. If you have questions about this lesson, you can ask at our next online session. You can also send an email to the address on the slide. If you're watching from YouTube, you can leave a comment below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you at the next lesson.